there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of some of my recent non-mystery reading, specifically the non-fiction. I was going to say, we'll go least to most depressing again, and we will sort of, but the other two books are pretty depressing, so we'll start with the objectively least depressing. And this is Mark L. Cushing's Pet Nation. The subheading on this one is The Inside Story of How Companion Animals Are Transforming Homes, Culture, and the Economy. And this book is primarily focused on the United States, although I think it applies to a number of countries. And it's basically about the explosion in pet ownership over the past 20 years, because one of the points that the author is making is that having either a dog or a cat as a house pet has basically exploded by 40% in the United States over the past 20 years. And within the past 2 years, this was published in 2021, and so there is only a little note at the end about how though that number has kind of doubled again since the pandemic, and what that means both socially and economically in terms of family spending, because you have to buy food for this cat, this dog, you have to pay for veterinary care, and as it becomes more common, are people spending money on more ridiculous things like clothes for their pets. And I do laugh at that because if you watch my outros on most of my videos, you will see I currently have a dog who wears clothes. It is because she's short. None of my past dogs had clothes. Not because this dog is more of a house dog, but just because she's short. They get muddy. Nobody told me if you have a shorter dog, their chests are muddy all the time. That's my defense. In any case, that's aside from that. And the social piece is interesting as well because he talks about the rise of pet ownership alongside dropping birth rates, and not necessarily in the really cheap way where it's like, oh, if this person has cats and not kids, then they're a crazy cat lady, or this person thinks their dog is their baby, but it's a dog, and what's wrong with people? He's not doing that, but what he is exploring is, are the social expectations then different if you have 10 friends, and it used to be 9 of your 10 friends would have had kids, and now 9 of your 10 friends have no kids but do have pets that they spend a lot more of their time and money on because they don't have kids and they're spending that time and money somewhere else. Not because the relationship is necessarily viewed as the same, although obviously for some people it is. And then what does that mean? Because is your social life revolving around the dog park and things like that? If people used to joke about poor people eating cat food, can you still maintain that joke when people are buying the finest tunas for their cats? And so on. So this was really interesting as a social portrait, and just how starkly some of the numbers have changed. Like, one of the things that he talks about is euthanasia rates in shelters, because I think a lot of people in North America are thinking about the status of animals in shelters from the 1980s or 1990s, when there was much more of a dramatic push and there were just millions of unwanted cats and dogs being euthanized every year. And with the growth of pet ownership, it just isn't true to the same extent in a lot of places. Now, in some parts of the southern US, that's still the case. But in a lot of places, like he's talking about the northern cities, and this is true here in Canada, for example, there are, as of today, I think there are 5 dogs available at our city shelter. And I'm in Toronto. This is the largest city in Canada. There are very few dogs available. If you want to adopt a dog rather than going to a breeder, you basically have to get them from either up north where it's only huskies, or you have to go out of the country. Like, my dog came through a shelter, but from the United States. You regularly see people who have brought over dogs from places like the southern US, Mexico, Dominican Republic, etc. Until recently from overseas. Canada recently put in a ban, and it's especially depressing now because some of the countries that are in the ban are Ukraine, Turkey, and Syria. Obviously, a lot of people would like to be able to bring over animals that have survived various catastrophes, but in any case, what am I talking about? Anyway, that's an aside. The main point, that has nothing to do with this book. This is about pets in the US. So anyway, but one of the points that he's making there is that because the kind of adopt, don't shop piece is out there, people will still talk about that and what it means in terms of people bringing home really inappropriate animals, because in these areas where there are very few animals in shelters, often it's because they're restricted breeds, which are difficult for people who aren't homeowners, or because they're incredibly large, which again is difficult if you live in a condominium with a weight limit and things like that. So that's an interesting piece of the part of the social piece that came out of when the percentage of pet ownership was lower and then the numbers of animals in shelters was higher, and what that means moving forward. And that's all really interesting, again, because here we have a lot of people who are, like, if you bring in a multi-generational street dog, the pot cake dogs, for example, that are really popular here now, training challenges are different there than you would have If you have, for example, a standard dog that was given up because the family decided they didn't, dog ownership wasn't for them, or a failed hunting dog like most of the dogs I've had, for example. In any case, very interesting. I think if you're interested in pet ownership as a social phenomenon, and mostly from a US perspective, that's what that is. It has lots of charts and graphs. I like charts and graphs, so there you go. And next up, I read Saidiya Hartman's Lose Your Mother, A Journey Along the Atlantic Slave Route. The author spent more than a year in Ghana doing academic research. She was working at one of the universities there. And this is not replicating her academic work. This is mostly a memoir in which she's discussing what it means as a descendant of enslaved peoples to be in West Africa and to kind of interrogate both other US Americans who have gone to move there, but also the locals who have kind of a different view on the history, but will sometimes perform the US expected version for tourism purposes. And as she lives there longer and sees more of it, how does that feel, and what is it fair to have expectations about things like that? And also digging into the whole sense of, she says in here, for example, that in some of languages that in some of the local languages the word for slave is a stranger, whether that emphasizes feeling estranged rather than feeling a homecoming. And in a different kind of diaspora story, you'd be going to visit your grandmother, great-grandmother, whatever's village, and how if you have no idea what that village is, what country it even was, isn't it still natural to want to have that experience, but can you expect to have it, and what does that mean? And so it's really interesting in a lot of ways. I think people who are looking for a more romantic homecoming story, a kind of, finding your roots kind of story, it's not really that. And I think if you are looking for something that is more strictly academic, because she is an academic, so you might go into it expecting that, it just isn't. It's a memoir, and she's very open about the emotional side of things, about, for example, going to the slave fort that a lot of tourists will visit, and just seeing how for local people, there are markets outside, they're not going to stare at the fort weeping every day because they live there, and this is just part of the setting. And that coming in as an outsider and expecting that, is that bringing your kind of American exceptionalism? And do you want to have to think about the fact that you have a kind of foreign money, you have a certain privilege that's associated with having a US passport, but the reason that you have a US passport is because 200 years ago, this crime against humanity happened, and it started at this place or a place like it. And what does that all look like? And also the attitudes towards the local slavery that had continued past the halt of the transatlantic slave route. So she will talk to people who had a grandmother who was a slave and married into the family, and they would leave the grandmother at home because she had tattoos that showed she was from the North, so people would know she was a slave, and you want to hide that. And then she's reflecting on that, like, what does that mean in a US setting where the default assumption is that anyone who is black is the descendant of an enslaved person? Where people ask her, oh, in the US, do people know that you're descended from enslaved people? And she's trying to explain to people for whom there might be a taboo about that because it's something that could be hidden, how it can't be hidden in a US context. At least not to the same extent, because obviously immigration into the US from West Africa is a thing as well, but like as a percentage, the assumption would still be there. And so a lot of that is really interesting if you're interested in somebody working through their thoughts on that, because again, that's what this is. It's grappling with history and what that means on a personal level. In the middle of this, there is a story about this enslaved girl who was tortured and then killed on one of the ships. And different stories about that. Was somebody charged with this? Was it how it became public knowledge? Which is it's quite graphic and horrific. And it does feel odd. Like it feels like that was something that she found in her academic studies, and it feels almost out of place in this. But at the same time, it feels like if there weren't any graphic torture story, would it feel like the book was making light of the whole history? I don't think it would, but maybe that's a question to be asked. I don't know. Yeah, so I thought this was a really interesting read, but I think it is worth remembering that when you are going into this is not a history. This is a memoir. So if you are looking for a history, the same author has academic works, and you can read the history. As I was reading it, I was thinking about Kamal Al-Solaylee's Return, which is about various returnees in various countries. And one of the places that he had mentioned was Ghana, and he's talking about both second generation British, Canadian, Ghanaians who went back to Ghana for work during the recession in 2008, but also about these American descendants of enslaved people who centuries later are going to Ghana and having a different kind of experience of living there. And I think this, if you were interested in that chapter, this fleshes that kind of thing out a lot more than the half chapter in that other book did. So that was really interesting as a follow-up to that. Finally, I have Susan M. Schweik's The Ugly Laws, Disability in Public. This is an academic work, and it is about a look at primarily the 19th century United States and various laws in various cities and states and counties that regulated whether visibly disabled people could appear in public, most of which were called ugly laws because you didn't want to offend the eyes with public displays of disfigurement and whatnot, and how that tied into things like veterans who had become disabled in like the US Civil War, for example, or how it applied to the eugenics movement with regard to immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, up in West Asia, with regard to formerly enslaved people, with regard to indigenous people a little bit, but not so much that, and also how elements of segregation played out in schools, for example, schools that were specifically for blind students and things like that. This is the kind of book that deserves a popular history because I think there is so much in here that is really fascinating, but it is incredibly dry to read. And it's odd because at certain points the author will even interject something, and you would think somebody who was a writer of popular nonfiction would make this a lot more entertaining. So I hope at some point that somebody does that, because I would love to recommend the information in this to people, but I just can't recommend the book to people who aren't interested in academic histories because it is really dry to read, but it compiles a lot of really important and fascinating stuff. Like the bits about people who were in sales and how there was an expectation that if you're some street salesman in the 19th century in the US, an able-bodied person, or someone who isn't visibly disabled at least, could just be selling something on the street and they were not likely to be arrested for offenses against the eyes of other people, minus elements of xenophobia, which is a side thing, but also that they had a permit system for people who were considered worthy, like, say, the veterans and whatnot. And so all of that, really interesting stuff. And if you are up to read something that is more on the academic side and go in knowing this is dry and not particularly readable, yeah, I do recommend this. I think a great fun project, I mean, fun is maybe the wrong word, but a great project would be somebody writing a popular history based on a lot of the same research, because that would be grand. And I think that would be, because, yeah, as I said, I would love to recommend that to people, but it is a boring read, so I can't. But the information is not boring, if that makes sense. This is one of those books where you read and think, are people any better off now than they were then, when there are still social pressures that make people feel like they can't leave their house? Or, I mean, minus the pandemic, because that gets into another issue with that. And I guess the moral of that story is at least it's not illegal to leave the house. So, you know, social pressures, but not legal pressures. And on that depressing note, that's my recent nonfiction reading. If you've read any of these books, I'd love to hear what you thought. If you have read a more academic version of this kind of thing, I'd love to hear about that. If you've read a less academic version of this kind of thing, I'd love to hear about that too, because those are both books where I feel like they needed to be paired with the flip side. I think it would have been ideal to be reading each of them with a similar book in the opposite style. So that would have been interesting. Something to look for, I guess. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.